Welcome everyone. I am Jay Brinker. I am the lecturer who does research in the psychology of humor. I have to say, I was nervous all day that no one would show up, and now you're all here, and I'm equally terrified. So I'm going to try and just keep calm and keep going. The reason I brought this together is because it is National Psychology Week. The Australian Psychological Society puts this on every year. And I'd say predominantly, because the APS is made up of mostly practitioner psychologists, that it tends to be focused on mental health. And I won't deny that mental health is important. I'm a clinical psychologist myself. But I think that sometimes it's important to look at just all of the variety of stuff that psychologists actually do, including research into weird stuff like humor. So, this is our little event today, Stand Up for Psychology, and I appreciate everyone showing up. It was a sold-out event, and judging by the empty seats, some people didn't show up, or some people are still arriving. Come on in. All right, so just as a bit of a background, humor has not always been a good word. So originally humor was actually something that's quite negative. It started out just meaning a liquid. So the liquid in your eyeball is still referred to as vitreous humor. And at some point in our prehistoric past, we decided that a balance of the liquids in your body actually was related to how you presented as a person. So it might make you melancholy, it might make you choleric, which is a bit grumpy. And they would basically say that if you had a good balance, you were in good humor. And that's when it started to mean something good. It's interesting because when we look at humor, we look at the history of humor, it's not always been seen as a good thing. The first one was the superiority theory. And a lot of our ancient philosophers thought that humor was actually quite crass and vulgar. And they saw it as simply a way of making yourself feel better than others. So this is when those really big shots would laugh at the fool, the person who slips on the banana peel. And a guy named Hobbes really disliked humor and thought that it was just the lowest form of human behavior. And of course we know it's not. But we still do recognize that sense of using humor as a bit of a feeling of superiority. I'm a Canadian, and I can tell you that to a Canadian, there's not much funnier than watching someone slip on the ice. There is a YouTube video that is called Epic Montage of People Slipping on Ice, and I can't watch it without crying with laughter. I have watched my nearest and dearest, from my mother to my 3-year-old niece, slip on the ice, and you go, "Ooh, are you okay?" And as soon as they are, you laugh, because it's funny. Watching somebody make a fool of themselves doesn't necessarily mean that you're cruel, but a lot of the times it's just funny. The other day I was pulling up my sleeve that was tighter than I expected and accidentally punched myself in the face. That's funny. Now I'd like to think that you're all laughing right now, but you don't universally think you are superior to me. You are simply superior to me in the sleeve pulling up domain. So this is one of the big theories. And this is really interesting because this comes into play when we start to talk about things like establishing social hierarchies and using aggressive humor. We use humor quite strategically. Humans are extremely savvy at their use of humor into establishing their sense of power or even reducing their own sense of power to bring somebody up. And we'll talk more about that later. Then we've got the release theory. This is a sense that the building of the joke creates a sense of tension, and the punchline, through that release of suddenly getting the answer, causes the laughter. So that, say a joke like, "Where do you find a turtle with no legs?" This is a question, and now you want to know the answer. You may have heard the joke, but even if you think you know the answer, you're still going to wonder if my answer is the same as your answer. I'd say that probably one of the most simplistic forms of the release theory is the knock-knock joke. Knock, knock, who's there? Last night, I spent a full half hour on the internet trying to find a funny knock-knock joke, and I didn't succeed. And all of the ones I read were so lame, I simply refused to include them. But it is that sense of you want to know the answer, and once you get that answer, it makes you laugh. How many of you want to know, more than anything, where do you find a turtle with no legs? I know, you're dying to know. And when I tell you, you will experience a release not unlike this balloon full of water. Do you want to know where you find a turtle with no legs? Wherever you left it. So that is the release theory. Now we have the disposition theory, and this is possibly the single most confusing psychology theory or theory of humor. Actually, I've got to say, this is from a philosopher, so that may explain things. I have read about this theory a dozen times, and I don't really quite get it. My understanding is that humor is funny because it has a disposition to make us laugh. I know. I actually thought about bringing the quote of the definition just to read to you, just so we could share in a sense of bonding over the confusion. But that is my summing up. Humor is funny because it has its own disposition to make us laugh. This one, I think, is actually a very interesting theory because it suggests that we cannot experience humor without the physiological ability to laugh, which is why I've got a brain in a jar. So essentially, even if it is a very microscopic twitch of the corner of your mouth, that is a physiological response in its most minor form of laughter, and that's what humor is. But my question is, if you were a brain in a jar, and we were to activate different parts of the brain that felt like the parts of the brain that would light up when you're laughing, would it be the same thing? And I checked with the neuropsychologist here at Swinburne, and I said, if you imagine yourself laughing when you're in an MRI, would the brain light up in the same way as if you were actually laughing? And they said yes. It may be slightly reduced in its amplitude, but the brain would be exactly the same, whether you're imagining it or whether you're actually laughing. And this is fascinating to me because if you can imagine you're laughing, is your brain laughing? If your mouth isn't laughing and your lungs aren't laughing and your head isn't laughing, can your brain still be laughing if your brain is lighting up as if the rest of you was laughing? So that's the disposition theory of humor. The last theory we're going to talk about today is the incongruity theory. Now, the incongruity theory suggests that the reason something is funny is because you're carrying along with one expectation and the punchline is incongruous to what you expected. So my example for this is there's two fish in a tank, and one turns to the other and says, "Do you know how to drive this thing?" That is incongruous because you were thinking of a fish tank. But the joke is about a military tank. Now, fish driving a military tank, that's just funny. They have fins. They can drive. This is one of my favorite photos because I'm Canadian, and that's not Christmas. That is incongruous. To be wearing what would appear to be a red flannel suit and a big bushy beard in the heat of summer. So that is incongruous, and that's why it's funny to me. I don't know why you're laughing. So that's the incongruity theory. And these are just basically the reasons why we think things are funny. But the truth is we find a lot of stuff funny. There's funny stuff everywhere. There's entire shows made up of funny. There's books made up of funny. And we choose the people around us based on their sense of humor. This is one thing that I will ask you to take away from here. Even the least funny people that I have met in my life still have some sense of humor, okay? I am sure that everyone here has either made a joke or laughed at a joke at some point in their lives. But we still say, what are you looking for in a partner? Maybe somebody who's attractive, someone who's intelligent, but I can assure you that on most people's list is sense of humor, even though we actually haven't defined what that is. Show of hands, how many of you think somebody has a good sense of humor if they can produce humor? All right. By show of hands, how many of you think someone has a good sense of humor by how many laugh at your joke? I'm sorry, but if someone's not laughing at my jokes, they simply have no sense of humor. I'm brilliant. So this is a very two-part process. The ability to produce humor is one thing, but the ability to perceive your brilliance and to laugh appropriately is a completely separate ability. And we do know that humor is really important when it comes to liking. The interesting thing is that when you go through the humor plus liking literature, there is a bit of a two-way street. And it's interesting because we say that we like people with a good sense of humor. But when they do the research on this, it's always very linear. So they'll take a person and they'll say, here's a person. Do you like them and do you find them funny? So they're asking the question at the same time. And this is really difficult because even though the liking and the humor can be related, we can't say that one is causing the other. It could very much be that the people that you like, you see as more funny. And this is really evident in, Bill, you're so funny. And everyone else, Bill's not so funny. This is where I start to see the people that you like are the people that you find amusing. It may not last through 20 years of marriage, but in the beginning. This is one of the things that I find very interesting, and this is really difficult about psychological research, is that in order to prove causation, essentially what we need to do is hold everything else constant and manipulate one thing. So this would be like taking two identically attractive people, making one funny and making one not funny, and parading them in front of a bunch of opposite-sex participants. It's unlikely to find somebody that is exactly equally attractive to everyone. The interesting thing is that when we do a lot of attraction research, we start to use what's computer-generated faces that are an amalgam of the attractive people of the world, and we just sort of smoosh them all together. It's very difficult to do with humor. Humans are the most complex organisms on Earth, and any research that is investigating them is rife with problems. The romantic literature on humor and who we're selecting as mates, who we like, those kinds of things is always very tricky. How many of you feel like the one time in life you can't be funny is when you have to be funny? So if I brought you in and I said, okay, we're doing an experiment. Here's your unknown partner to you, but we need you to be funny to win them over. So there's fish and a turtle with no legs, and you're just not going to be funny. So manipulating humor is actually quite difficult. We're doing some research now looking at the perception of humor, and we're only just beginning to discover all of the problems related to this. And it's really, it's frustrating, but at the same time, possibly the most interesting thing. Where am I now? One other thing I wanted to bring up was the idea of power relationships. Power in relationships is really quite complex because we have different levels of power depending on where we are. As a lecturer, I have some power over students, but as a lecturer, I have no power over my dean. So depending on what position I'm filling will actually change my level of power. So when we do experimental research on this, there's a research project out there that was looking at power. And basically they brought in two people. One is a Confederate, so this is somebody who's in on the joke. We've got somebody else. We give them a task, and we assign one to be the leader, and we give them the power. And the way that they interact and the way that they use humor is then monitored. And one of the interesting things that comes out of this research is that the use of humor actually reduces the likelihood of someone vetoing your actions. So out of all the research now, this is the one that I find most interesting, is that if you use humor, you're less likely to be influenced by somebody else. And I think that's really important to know when it comes to interpersonal relationships. Now, so far I've talked about humor as if it's a unitary construct, but it's really not. There's so many different kinds of humor. And there's a guy in Canada that I worked with during my grad school. His name is Rod Martin, and he is the nicest man on the planet. And I've met them all. And he really is just a brilliant researcher. And he has actually devised the idea that there's different humor styles, and he came up with 4. So the first one is, not advancing, oh wait, affiliative. Was that the first one? All right. So affiliative humor is just the kind that we have when we're chatting with friends. It's benign, it's not aggressive, it's just sort of safe funniness that you share when you just want to, make everyone happy. So affiliative humor is really good for social interactions. Then we've got self-enhancing. And this is actually sort of your private musings. This is your own internal sense of humor. Now, self-enhancing humor is those sort of moments when you're standing by yourself at a bus stop and you see something funny that no one else sees and you start laughing. And you look crazy, but that's okay, because you were laughing at something funny. And it doesn't even have to be something that was funny to everyone else. And I'm sure you've had this experience where you're sitting there by yourself and you see something that just cracks you up and no one else thinks it's funny and they just think you're weird. It's not just me, right? But this internal sense of self-enhancing humor is really important because this ability to see the absurd in life is one of the things that's actually quite related to your own mental well-being. And since we're here all about the Psych Week, this is something to consider. Then we've got self-defeating. And this is that sort of humor where you're putting yourself down or you're allowing someone else to put you down in a very sort of negative and hurtful way. And this is actually one of the more dangerous styles of humor when it comes to your own mental health. This is where you really do feel the hurt, but you continue to do it or let it happen because you're trying to ingratiate yourself to someone else or to appease them. So this is quite a negative form of humor. But some researchers here at Swinburne have said, you know what, when you put yourself down, it's not always a bad thing. It's not always taken seriously. One of the researchers is here, Mrs. Maren Rollins, and Bruce Finley, although are you doctor yet?
I'm a doctor.
Dr. Maren Rollins, she got her PhD here on this research. And Bruce Finley was her supervisor. And they came up with the idea that there can be self-deprecating humor. And this is humor where you're making fun of yourself and you're teasing yourself. But you don't take it to heart. And it doesn't have that same harmful side. So it is absolutely fine to make fun of yourself. It's not always bad, just so long as you're not taking it to heart and you're not doing it to appease others or to ingratiate yourself with them. And then finally, my favorite is aggressive humor. Not that I'm overly aggressive, but this is the one I like to research most. And this is a humor that is disparaging or vilifying, mocking others. And this actually sounds quite serious, but part of my research is in an attempt to demonstrate sort of parallel to Maren and Bruce, that aggressive humor when you're sort of teasing others isn't always meant with malice, and that there can be a kind of other deprecating humor. As a Canadian, I make fun of Americans all the time. It's like a national pastime. But we don't always mean it with malice. They're just such easy targets. I make fun of my friends. There's that playful teasing. There's the little jokes among people. I constantly make fun of my poor PhD student, Robin, who's right there. And everyone around here can raise their hands so that everyone will look at her. That's okay, because she'll be coming up here later to wear this silly hat. Nervous laughter. But this is the kind of humor that can be actually quite hurtful. But this is the one that I was talking about when I was talking about power relationships. This is where you can really strategically use humor to put someone in their place in an almost socially sanctioned way. One of the best instances I've ever witnessed was at a dinner party, and there was a married couple who were having a very strange growing old in my gender sucks more than growing old in your gender arguments. And as I'm watching this, it's like, yeah, well, you don't have this, and yeah, well, you don't suffer this, and yeah, well, this doesn't happen to you. And the guy said, yeah, well, at least you won't lose your hair. And the wife quickly put the kibosh in this argument by saying, oh, honey, you're not losing your hair. It's just sliding down your back. Conversation over. And that's the kind of thing where it's quite aggressive, and it sort of put him in his place, and it just sort of stopped the conversation. And this is very effective. This is also related to that idea of the superiority theory. A friend of mine has an evil stepmother, as many friends do, and we were sitting around, and somebody had actually said, "Where's Jean?" And her sister, bless her, sitting there quietly reading a book, pipes up and says, I don't know, sunning herself on a rock somewhere. And there's that same kind of biting humor that would have been meant with malice had Jean been in the room. But it did imply that we were somehow, as a collective, better than Jean. So aggressive humor can be quite biting, but it can also just be playful teasing, and I'm actually looking at the difference between those. All right. So again, there's 4 styles, 5 if we count Maren and Bruce's, 6 if we count my other deprecating. But the truth is that we don't just have one style. I wouldn't say my style is affiliative and your style is aggressive. The truth is that we mix and match, and we use them depending on the situation. Again, humans are extremely savvy at using these different things. Now, one of the things is the use of this humor. So affiliative humor, again, is really good at building relationships. Aggressive humor can actually break down relationships. The use of self-defeating humor has been related to depression, lower self-esteem, all sorts of negative outcomes. So it's a mix of different outcomes depending on the humor style that you predominantly use. But those can change. And again, when we're talking about psych research, we cannot say that it's the use of self-defeating humor that's leading to the depression. It could be that people who are depressed have activated an idea about themselves that is completely negative, and this just becomes all of the information that they have at hand to make jokes about. So we can't actually draw causal directions right now. What I want to look at is the perception of these styles. This is a great quote that has been attributed to a dozen people, so I have no idea who to actually give credit to, but it's not mine. We see things not as they are, but as we are. And is there something about the observer that actually has to do with the way humor is received or perceived? So how many of you have known somebody who seems almost extra sensitive to aggressive humor? And some people who just have a real thick skin and they'll laugh at pretty much anything. Some people who are really good at putting themselves down and not taking it to heart. And some people who put themselves down and it just makes you feel uncomfortable. You know when someone has put themselves down and they potentially mean it. And there's that sense of discomfort. It's another thing that we're looking at. Self-defeating versus self-deprecating. This is a project that I've been working on with my PhD student, Robin. And she gathered a bunch of information from people and then showed people a series of videos of stand-up comedians, what we saw as demonstrating the different humor styles. And the interesting thing is that when participants watched examples of self-defeating humor and examples of self-deprecating humor, even though we didn't tell them that that was the difference between them, they saw the people using the self-defeating humor as having lower self-esteem than those who were using the self-deprecating humor. So the participants were picking up on some subtle difference that says, I think you believe what you're saying. And that's kind of sad. so you must have lower self-esteem. But then these other people were saying, you're still making fun of yourself. But I get the sense that you don't really mean it. And so we can laugh at this together. This is one of the things that I would love to know what's happening in the brain when we can tell this difference. How do we know? Because we've all experienced when someone puts themselves down and we feel uncomfortable versus when someone puts themselves down and we can have a good laugh. The other thing I want to know is the way people perceive aggressive humor. Is there something about the person, the observer, that is going to predict how they're going to receive that aggressive humor? Aggressive humor is pretty common in media. And when we're trying to sort of gauge how people are going to take it and how we're going to have, or how they're going to respond to that, this would be interesting information. Research that I've recently done with 2 honor students who are currently writing an ethics exam, so they couldn't be here tonight. They did the same thing. They showed participants a series of videos illustrating aggressive humor, and then looked to see what observer variables might predict what they're seeing or how their ratings of aggressiveness. And it's interesting because the only real strong predictor that came out was the observer's negative mood, the level of negative mood they're experiencing, actually predicted how aggressive they saw the video. Their own aggressiveness, their own personality, their own self-esteem had nothing to do with that prediction. It was just their own negative mood. The more negative their mood, so the more sad or anxious they were feeling in that moment, the more they saw that the comedian was being aggressive. The next one, I think this is really interesting, is that the more aggressive the rating of the comedian's humor, the more the participant thought that they meant it. So whereas I was looking at the idea that there's going to be something else that suggests the comedian intends harm or doesn't, for these videos, it was simply that the more aggressive that the video was, the more they thought the comedian actually meant it to be hurtful. And I think that's really important, because sometimes we make jokes and we don't necessarily know how aggressive it is, and we may not know exactly how hurtful the person who's observing it sees it as. Back to the social hierarchy. So we've got aggressive humor and we've got self-defeating humor, and this interplay between sort of putting ourselves down or building ourselves up really helps to showcase this. And I think that this is really interesting. One of the things that we don't tend to pay attention to is how many times we put ourselves down to put someone else at ease. And one of the projects that I'm going to be working on with Jennifer Beaudry, she's another academic here, who, by the way, is giving a public lecture on the psychology of police investigations over at the Hawthorne Library on the 24th. It's on Eventbrite. I'm going. We're going to be looking at the use of humor in court proceedings. In particular, the opening and closing statements. Now, I will confess, Jen is the one who knows about forensic psychology. Some total of my knowledge about court proceedings comes from Matlock. But I can imagine that lawyers, when they are trying to get a jury or a judge on side, would very likely use humor either to make themselves seem less intimidating, perhaps with the jury, we're all in this together, I'm just a normal bloke, or to try and put the other side down, to make a joke that would make them look foolish. And I think that that's something that we see a lot in everyday life that might be difficult to measure. My titles are coming up late. And then we've got the power relationships, and I think that this is really important. It's interesting because there's research that shows that academics, so lecturers, who use humor are seen as more informative and more knowledgeable. I know. That's why I've been cracking jokes all night. And it's interesting because realistically, we have an idea of academics being quite staid, plaid-wearing, dull. One of my former colleagues at the university that I last worked at, who I will say has minimal sense of humor, I had cracked the joke that for as many anti-inflammatories, ibuprofens, as I take, you'd think I'd be thinner. He went on to explain the chemistry of this and how it can work. And I think that's the general view of academics. But we do have a kind of power, and if we use humor, we can actually make ourselves seem far less threatening. And there's actually research about physicians using humor. And physicians who are able to use affiliative humor and joke with their patients and put their patients at ease are seen as more knowledgeable and more trustworthy, and I think that's really interesting. Now, of course, this suddenly puts pressure on all of us. It's like, I want to seem friendly and knowledgeable. And again, it's very difficult to be humorous on demand. But I think it is that sense of sort of developing your own sense of humor, your own ability, your own comfort with it, and that to look at how that actually plays out in your relationships. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about today is humor in the brain. This is one of my areas that I'm trying desperately to get into. I have a neuropsych background, so I do a lot of research in depression in the brain and emotion in the brain in general. But humor in the brain is really complex. One of the tricky things is that humor, again, being multifaceted, has a lot of different parts to it. So the first thing, of course, that's going to happen is that you're probably looking at something, whether it be someone speaking or the written word. So your visual system is going to be activated. And then you've got the language areas. So most humor, aside from people slipping on ice, tends to be verbal. So you're going to be using different language centers of the brain. So these centers will probably also light up. And then you've got the cognitive part of understanding the joke, which I have no doubt most of you can. This is your frontal lobes, and these are the parts of the brain that are almost kind of, they're understanding the cognitive aspects, and this is the part of your brain that is sending out feelers into the future to try and anticipate the punchline, which is what makes it funny when there's that incongruous answer. So that's your frontal lobes. And then we've got the emotion centers of the brain. This is where we experience mirth. Now, mirth is the word that Rod Martin uses to describe the emotion that we feel when we are amused, when we encounter humor. So mirth would be somewhere in our emotion centers of our brain. When we think about things like self-defeating humor, self-deprecating humor, or aggressive humor, there could be very different activity here. So if someone made a joke about you that was quite hurtful, all of the other parts would probably still be lighting up, but the activity of your emotion centers could be quite different. And this is where I want to go when I'm looking at how the brain responds to different humor styles. Now, I have access to this lovely, ridiculous little hat, which is an EEG device. This actually only detects on the surface. So this is only good for the wrinkly part on the outside. But the nice thing about this is that it's mobile. Makes you look a little bit like Beetlejuice, if that's all right. So this little thing at the back transmits wirelessly to your computer. And we were actually going to demonstrate this. I was going to make poor Robin wear the Beetlejuice hat in front of everyone. But this tiny little transmitter decided to die. And I ordered another one, but it hasn't arrived because, believe it or not, this comes from Spain. So, I know, who knew? The Spanish, we're so good at making stuff like that. But mostly it was just tapas. But yeah, so we can actually put this on anyone. And I'm doing some work with some comedians, and I will be calling on these three later on to wear the hat someday when you're doing stand-up. Well, yeah. Why not? Really? It's good fun. Good fun. Let's see what's happening in the comedian's brain when they're producing humor. Because as I mentioned, there's the two parts. There's the perceiving and there's the producing. I would also love to get some comedians in an MRI machine and show them the different humor stimulus to see what's happening there. But the truth is that, again, humans are complicated and brains are ridiculously complicated. And the sad part is that it's also very expensive. To get one person in the MRI is about $200. So if you're trying to get up some participants, it takes a fair lot of money. So that's a bit slow going. But eventually, we would definitely like to look at what's happening in the brain. So what now? What now? Thank you for all coming and listening and laughing. And basically, what now is if you are a student, come and work with me. Do a PhD, let's do some research in humor. If you're a comedian, please let me measure your brain. One of the things that we desperately need is standardized stimuli. We have been using YouTube clips of stand-up comedians, but we don't know the intentions of those comedians. So we can't actually say for sure whether they meant malice, whether they actually meant self-defeating or self-deprecating. So I desperately need some comedians to help me make stimulus videos, and then you can tell me what you meant to do. It doesn't need to be you guys. I'm just picking on you because you're here. But if you know people, seriously, have them call me. The other thing is that we're building a repertoire of written humor stimuli, because one of the things that we realized was that you know a lot about, is this kind of going in and out? No, okay. I'm just having a stroke, that's all. One of the things we noticed when we were looking at these videos and we're asking questions about the comedian's self-esteem or the comedian's intent or those kinds of things, is that if it's a famous comedian like Joan Rivers or somebody like that, we already have a preconceived notion about that person. And there's a lot of facets about that comedian, even if we don't know them, their gender, their appearance, that could be influencing our perception of that humor. So we're going to try and look at written humor as well. Once we have these stimuli and we've standardized and validated them, then we can start to take participants and put them in the MRI or the EEG and start to look at things like their observer variables and how that might relate to how they see humor. If you happen to be a wealthy person and you just don't know what to do with your money, there's this brilliant thing called a philanthropic grant. And as I mentioned, it costs about $200 to get a participant into an MRI machine. If you wanted to be a participant and pay for it, well, call me, because that'd be great. But realistically, research needs money, and it's really hard to make humor sound sciencey. But then, you know, you watch Heston, and you realize that there's somebody out there who's a Victorian pudding expert. And then I feel quite good about myself again. This is my Facebook page. This is my research website. Keep your eye out. You can also just be a participant. So we've got research going on all the time. I've got 2 projects starting up about Facebook. So the use of humor on Facebook and emotion on Facebook. So if you're interested, watch this space. But other than that, I just want to say thank you. Where did you come from? I want to say thank you, mostly to all of you for coming. Thank you very much for showing up. Next is the Swinburne University Psych Association. These are all the lovely volunteers who guided you here, put up balloons, and will now be serving you wine. So thank you to SUPA. Thanks to the Department of Psychs, because they're the ones who have paid for the wine and the food. Thanks to these people who have been super helpful in helping me set everything up and organize everything. And thanks to the Brain and Psychological Science Research Institute, because if I put this in here, they may give me a discount on using the MRI. Thanks to the comedians. They were brilliant. Absolutely fabulous. Follow them. We've got DVDs for sale. Buy one. Follow them. Go to the events, support your local comedians. It's good for your soul to laugh. And I say that as a clinical psychologist, not as a religious figure, because I actually don't know anything about the soul. Anyway, big, big thanks to Bo Fitzpatrick, and I asked about it, the publisher of Yop magazine. Go read the magazine. I'm a contributor once a month. Very last page. I don't take that as a reflection of how they feel about me. And he puts on a fantastic show last Wednesday of every month called The Good Hurt. Fantastic comedians. And he is such a spectacular guy that he has agreed that any Swinburne students or Swinburne staff, free tickets. Pretty amazing. We're actually going to go to a comedy show for free. Support the system. That's my thing. All right, so go to his website or his Facebook page. Lots of information there about The Good Hurt. Go to Yop magazine. Go to the shows. Have a good time. Go get wine. Thank you.